Thank you, Matthew, and thank you everyone for being here today. We'll be talking about this other wonderful, exciting, slightly scary change that's happening parallel to electrification, which is essentially that the robots are coming and they want to drive you places. And so we'll be talking about that technology a little bit, and also then talking about how we in Australia are trying to adapt our roadside legal environment so we can facilitate and mitigate some of the issues around automated vehicles. It's important that I acknowledge the Turrbal and Yugar people, who are the First Nation owners of the land where QUT now stands. I pay respect to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. I recognise these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning, and I also acknowledge, and QUT acknowledges, the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT and the Australian community. All right, let's talk about automated driving. It's important to begin this by understanding that the history of the motor vehicle has been a history of increasing automation from the very beginning. The minute Carl Benz rattled down the street 130 years ago, engineers and salespeople have been trying to make the car easier for humans to drive and use. And so we've had a very long history of things that humans once did to dynamically do the driving, the dynamic driving tasks, the engineers call it, have increasingly, for a very long time, been automated. That automated was often very simple systems, like batteries, power steering systems, automatic transmissions, but then increasingly, since the late 1970s, increasing electronic intervention in the dynamic driving task, ABS brakes being the most obvious. So cars, increasingly the vehicle itself making decisions to either assist or override the human control inputs, have had a long history. But what we've seen in the last 10 years, and in particular the last 5 years, is, to pardon the pun, a real acceleration of that trajectory towards automation of the dynamic driving task. So much so that we have a very clear set of criteria for understanding different levels of automation. And this is the criteria provided by the Society of Automated Engineers. Most up-to-date version was this year, and this is the one that we have actually officially adopted in Australia to help us describe the types of automation. It's 6 levels. The first 3 levels, level 0 automation, 1 automation and 2 automation, are essentially vehicles that we are very familiar with now. These are vehicles where there is some degree of electronic assistance, but the paradigm of a human behind a wheel, pouring at pedals, thinking about where to go remains unchanged. The computers are merely assistants. Where it gets interesting is that from level 3 onwards. So level 3, 4 and 5, conditional automation, high automation and what we call full automation, is where all the interest is. These are the vehicles where the machine will drive itself to a certain degree. The example that we're most interested in is the conditional automation, because this is what is commercially available now in various high-end products. These are where the onboard computer system, which we'll talk about shortly, the automated driving system, can undertake the dynamic driving tasks, so steering, throttle, brakes, but also a degree of journey planning and control, i.e. you can tell it to go to a point, it will drive there, it will take corners, it will overtake, it will keep within speed limits. One of the important things we talk about, or the engineers talk about, is within certain driving, they call them domains, in certain driving environments. So we can get conditional automated vehicles now in Australia, but they are only conditional automated in, for example, the highway driving environment. The highway is, contrary to what you might experience as a learner driver, For computerization, the highway environment is actually the easiest for the robot to navigate. It's the least complicated, the least unexpected things happen. So it's the low-hanging fruit for automation. So we do have vehicles that are pretty well level 3, able to do at least highway level 3 in Australia at the moment. Highway, level 3 urban is a lot more complicated. We'll talk about that shortly. The next one is the level 4, which is the high automation. The level 3 is important because the human remains the fallback ready user, to use their phrase. So the human has to be in the loop, has to be paying attention, and if the robot says, human, I'm struggling to do something here, take control, the human must respond. A level 4 vehicle, when it's in automation, the human is not the safety driver. In a level 4 vehicle, within its operational domain, if the vehicle is having trouble, officially it should just work the problem out itself or pull over and shut down. So the difference between 3 and 4 is in 3, the human is the fallback user, and in 4, if needs be, the computer will shut down. It might notify a human occupant it's having trouble, but if it doesn't get a response, it will shut down. So the example is this. In a level 3 vehicle, if the human driver falls asleep and the vehicle says they're having trouble, the vehicle will just disengage and bad things will happen. In a level 4 vehicle, if the driver is asleep and the vehicle says I'm having trouble and the human doesn't respond, the level 4 vehicle should pull over and stop. There's sort of the big engineering differences. Again, it's all about the driving domain. So whether this is on the highway is one thing, but whether we can get that to city driving and complicated high sensory load in driving environments is an entirely different story. The final one is the full automation. The full automation vision is the human is not in the loop at all. There is no controls for humans, arguably in the cabin, and the robot can handle every and all driving environments. Importantly, what we're looking at is you will soon be buying vehicles in Australia that might be level 4 highway, level 3 urban driving. So these levels aren't exclusive, they're dependent on the type of driving environment is how we define them. But let's talk a bit about the vehicles. These are the levels, and we often rattle off the levels because these have important implications for legal liability and who's responsible for the vehicle, depending on which one of these levels is in operation at the time. But regardless of the level, automated vehicles are basically 3 components. The first component is they are equipped with a whole range of communication devices, essentially to sense the environment around them. These can range from the basic proximity sensors that have been familiar now for about 20 years on vehicles, through to visual cameras, through to proper radar systems, proper LiDAR or laser radar systems, GPS systems, and of course connectivity to the 4G and particularly the 5G networks. Different firms have different versions of these. The private motor vehicle companies are tending to focus on vehicles just with visual cameras and then really complicated AI developed interpretive programs of what the visual camera's seeing, because visual cameras are a lot cheaper to put on a car, while the commercial autonomous vehicles, where cost is not necessarily as important, tend to use LiDAR and 5G, which is a much more precise physical system for censoring the world around them. All of them, of course, are hybrids. They all use multiple systems, but often it comes down to which is the primary way that the vehicle sees the environment. So Tesla, for example, has just moved to full cameras for their vehicles, but I said, yeah, some of the big, heavy prime mover autonomous constructors and some of the buses that you'll see, and some of the buses trialled in Australia, use LiDAR and 5G as well as cameras to sense the world around them. Of course, the most important thing is once they receive that input, it's got to be processed, and there is a division between whether that processing is done inside the vehicle, so whether the vehicle's got a fairly high-end, highly complicated computer running very sophisticated software to identify the world around them and work out things. So that's your Teslas and your vehicles like that have a very high power onboard processing unit? Or do we actually outsource that processing unit via the cloud to a central point making those decisions? And some of the in development mass mobility as a system type environments, which we'll talk about shortly, are using that sort of idea that the brains of the machine is elsewhere, and the machine itself is just a fairly basic, receives commands from the central unit. And of course, the third part is, of course, that the dynamic driving tasks have to be roboticized. So throttle, brakes, and everything else are connected to servos that operate by the processing unit. So regardless of what type of vehicle and what its use are, these are the three central elements. And together we call this the automated driving system. Okay, so automated driving uses. So there's, the most obvious one we think about is the private motor vehicle, which is actually proving to be the more difficult one to achieve. Why? Private motor vehicles firstly must be built to a price. And some of this technology, as I said, particularly the LiDARs and the 5G connectivity, is not something that's readily available across all driving domains that a private vehicle might be in. So they have to be to a price. And they also have to be used in across every driving domain, from someone's paddock across to freeways, across to complicated urban school pickup points, which are the most chaotic and worrying environment for an automated vehicle. So that's why we're probably not seeing yet full automation available in private vehicles yet. The cost of achieving it and versus the complexities of having to go in all sorts of driving domains. We're seeing a lot of development in heavy vehicles, particularly passenger, particularly automated buses, to be used in very controlled and programmed routes. The advantage here, if it's a very controlled, pre-mapped route, the processor inside the vehicle can just focus on obstacle avoidance. It's not focusing on where it's going because it knows it's hardwired into where it's going. And so we're seeing a lot of those, and they're also built, don't need to be necessarily built to a price. So they also might be used in environments where there's 5G. So for example, in Thailand, there's a whole range of automated ambulances running to hospitals within a 5G soaked radius, a 5-kilometre radius of the hospital. And so the automated, because of the bandwidth allowable in 5G, they can then run an automated ambulance fleet, small electric ambulance fleet within that environment. The other big use, of course, is automated heavy vehicles. We in Australia actually lead the way for this, with many of the big mining vehicles now on mining sites are fully automated. Some of them are remote. Increasingly, they're becoming fully automated. Again, it's a controlled environment. They know exactly where they're going. The whole site is mapped. It's soaked in radio waves with 5G and various other network systems. So it's a very controlled environment for automation. And the driver there clearly is safety. Get the humans away from the big, scary machines. Emergency, I mentioned the ambulances, but there's a really good example to have, say, vehicles that are delivery of fire response in bushfires, land vehicles that are automated. Again, keep the humans away from the danger. Drive in the tanker has a big robotised cannon on the top, start spraying water, the humans are nowhere near the actual fire front. And the final one, and this is the one that Apple and Google think they're going to make their next trillions of dollars out of, is the mobility as a service. This is really what Uber is a test frame for. Uber is about developing software where people can call up transport on their phones. The vision, of course, is we do away with the Uber driver and his car, and we have a little electric people pod, trundles up, takes you where you want to go, trundles off, goes to the next customer. And so this mobility as a service is very much the vision for the high-tech companies. And Waymo, which is actually a Google company, has just released autonomous taxis in 2 US cities. So they have fully autonomous taxis in the inner side of the cities, collecting people to go for drives now. Phoenix, Arizona is the lead one. Again, they can do that at the moment because they're operating within a high density, highly mapped, as far as the engineers are concerned, a quite known controlled environment. So they can sort of pre-program the vehicles and therefore the processor on the vehicle can be just focused on obstacle avoidance rather than bigger questions of journey managing and things like that. So they're the uses of automated vehicles. But we've got a real problem for the legalities of automated vehicles in Australia. And here is the problem. If you go to any law related to cars in Australia, you'll see this, something like this. This is Section 20 of the Road Rules. This is one that many of us might have unfortunately come afoul of now and again. A driver must not drive at a speed over the speed limit applying to the driver for the length of road where the driver is driving. Now that makes perfect sense. It means you human don't speed as the driver. Now so here's an issue. How does that work for an automated vehicle? If we look at the definition of driver, a driver is defined as a person. Okay, that's all right. What does a person mean? Well, if we go to a bit of a helping legislation that we have in Australia that helps us define terms, we have a thing, we have a person is defined as either a corporation or an individual. That's good. Okay, what's the individual? Well, know what a corporation is. That's an entity established under the Corporation Act. We can point to the ASX registry or various other places where lists of corporations are kept. So we know what a corporation is. What's an individual? Well, in Queensland here, an individual is a natural person. Oh, guess what, guys? When the robot's driving the car, it's not a natural person or a corporation. Therefore, it's not a driver. Therefore, sorry, officer, the robot was driving the car, but it's not the driver at law, so it's okay for it doing 120 to 60 zone. Section 20 of the Road Management Transport Act doesn't apply. As you can imagine, the police departments and transport ministers have a bit of an issue. A bit of an issue is that the entity when we've regulated cars in Australia and everywhere else, we've assumed a thing called a driver, and we've defined the driver as the human who has legal responsibility, or sometimes a corporation. This is a real problem. It's a real problem around a whole range of issues. The issues are, firstly, the road rules, as I've just pointed out. Suddenly the road rules, formally, officer, don't apply to my robot. 2, liability and compensation. Most of the time, compensation is based on drivers causing accidents. Hey, the robot was doing the driving, not officially a driver. I'm not liable for that accident, sorry. There's issues around the accreditation and assurance, i.e. how do we know these things are going to be safe when they come into the country? How do we ensure they remain safe over their lifespan? There's questions about how do they interface with the roadside enforcement? How do they, a policeman currently told someone to stop. How's that going to work for an automated vehicle? There's whole issues around the commercial use of automated, and as I've indicated, that's probably where we're going to see more and more automation, maybe in the commercial deployment first up, before we start getting 100% or fully automated vehicles available for private use. And then the one that a lot of people are worried about is what do we do about the data that these things generate? What's the privacy concerns? Who accesses that data and how? We have another problem in Australia. All the laws about road and vehicles are state responsibilities. Now, as we've currently seen at the moment, the states and territories just love working together and to solve problems of national interest. It's the joy of federation, and it's also the curse. So, believe it or not, we've had 120 years developing laws around cars. Each state and territory is a little bit different. We do try to coordinate through a thing called the National Transport Commission, but ultimately the National Transport Commission can't make the states implement laws. It's a vehicle for the states to agree on what they're going to introduce together. So, we have a range of challenges. The road rules are obviously a problem. The solution is, we have a solution. The Transport Ministers have agreed to introduce changes to the road rules in every state and territory to implement this agreement. For level 0 and 2, the human remains in control. It doesn't change the established paradigm. Level 3, where the ADS is operating, a thing called the Automated Driver System Entity will be in control. And the only issue there would be it wouldn't be in control if the ADS had notified the fallback user to take control. For level 4 and 5s, the ADS is deemed to be in control, and therefore the ADSE will be the entity legally controlled. Problem is, the ADSE is not defined or determined, and the agreement does say it has to be a corporation. So the vision is that anyone that wants to have an automated vehicle, sell an automated vehicle, or operate an automated vehicle in Australia will nominate to be an automated driving system entity and will assume the legal liability for the vehicle. That's the assumption, but I said it's just a plan. Liability. Each state and territory have compulsory third-party liability schemes. This is our Rego scheme, so if you cause personal injury in a car accident, there will be adequate compensation, or at least compensation for the person injured. Queensland, it's fault-based. It relies upon the driver being at fault. Problem. What happens if there's no driver? It was just the robot. However, in many other states, New South Wales and Victoria have actually what we call no fault. In other words, it doesn't matter if there was a driver at fault. The issue is, was there a person injured by a motor vehicle? If there was, there's compensation. We also have, for catastrophic injuries from motor vehicles, a national injury disability scheme. That's also no fault. But this is only for personal injury. What about if your vehicle damages property? You know, the whole dilemma of if you run into, a Tesla Model S and how expensive that is. That still just remains, of course, the responsibility of the owner and if you have comprehensive insurance. And that's still fault-based. So those things are still fault-based, which has all the problems of who's responsible, who's the driver. Ministers have agreed that the same control agreement for road rules should apply to CTP. But again, no one's done any changes to implement that yet. Some importers, such as Volvo, have announced that they will assume liability, both for personal and property damage, for injuries caused when their vehicles were in automated mode. Accreditation insurance is a big one. So how are we going to ensure these things are safe when they come into the country? There is currently a draft change to the Australian design rules for vehicles to cover automated driving systems, replicating similar changes that are coming in the European Union. So, and one of the important ones is that all these systems will have a back door for emergency and policing. In other words, that there will be some sort of ability for the police or the emergency services to switch off ADSs if in certain circumstances. So there's a protocol there. What about once they're on the road, how do we ensure that they remain safe? There's been an agreement just in the last couple of months to establish a new national safety law for automated vehicles. And this will be where we define this thing called the ADSE and impose on the ADSE a general safety duty. And then there'll be a regulator to ensure that the ADSEs are doing their job. And this is a model that they sort of have with heavy vehicles at the moment with the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator. So the vision will be that anyone that brings these vehicles in the country will have to nominate to be this corporation. Now this is fine if you're bringing in commercial vehicles. This is a bit more problematic for the private vehicle providers. Tesla, for example, has said, no way are we going to be involved in this. This isn't what we do. We sell this technology and that's it. So there's some pushback on this scheme from some of the players in the industry within Australia, but this is what the ministers have agreed on at the moment. Roadside enforcement's an issue. State and territory laws give lots of power to police and transport officials to engage with vehicles on the road. They all have very different sets of powers. Many powers are also directed to drivers. And currently, there's a real problem that the powers that are directed to vehicles, so in other words, the powers that allow police officers to, for example, put out tyre puncturing. So you can picture EV vehicles out of control, not responding, emergency and police are responding to that vehicle, and it's careering out of control. How do they stop it? Those abilities to access vehicle level constraints across the state and territories are actually really different. Some of them require the commissioner to sign off on. Some of them require just the police officer to think that there's a moment of danger. There's great differences in this. So there's some real problems here about what do we do if one of these things are out of control? What are the legalities around the police or emergency services interfering with those vehicles? Every state and territory is different. Commercial, and as I said, this is where we're going to probably see automation, and we already are seeing automation, but we're probably going to see automation on the highway with heavy vehicles first, which is a bit of a sobering thought, that we're suddenly talking about having prime movers barrelling down the M1 without a driver. That's actually more likely than us being able to get a fully automated private vehicle within the next 5 years. There is in the States already fully automated semi-services working dedicated routes. True Simple, which is their rig is there, is one of those. Again, the National Heavy Vehicle laws, which are fairly new and were only agreed to in 2012 and introduced, don't provide any capacity for understanding automation. It's all about drivers, driver fatigue, regulating drivers, and things like that. So there's problems there if we want to introduce automated semi-trailers and commercial vehicles. And the other problem is that also for the heavy vehicle laws, again, Australian states being good at cooperating, it's meant to be a national scheme, but WA and Northern Territory aren't part of it. So we have some problems with that scheme too. Passenger transport, so we're talking buses in particular here. Again, every state and territory is really different. Some state and territories now have laws for ride sharing that might cover those sort of automatic people pod type systems, but there's nothing in those laws at the moment dealing with what do we do with automated vehicles and automated vehicle entities. And the final one, and this is probably the one that people, when they think about it, so the first question people think about with automated vehicles is, who's liable when I'm hurt? The second one is, hang on, these things are like my phone, but even more so. How am I going to deal with who's going to know where I go? What's going to happen to the data? So no matter what formal technical automated system's being used, so they're going to want that data for their technical purposes. It just so happens that they can then use that to beam ads to your car as you drive past Starbucks or Macca's. So big issues with that. And firstly, what about you as the owner? Do you want the access to this data? One of the parallel things that is happening with this technology is the reduction of the right to repair, the reduction of the right of powers we as owners have over the machine that we have. And so this is a general pattern across the board. It's a bad pattern with normal vehicles at the moment, but this becomes magnified with automated vehicles. And can we get access to the data? Can we download our data? Can we restrict our data? How's this going to work? It's emergent already because most new cars do still communicate and share data with their manufacturer, and therefore this is going to become more and more. We have a Privacy Act in Australia from 1988. It's an old pen and paper document vision, and it's entirely inadequate for dealing with particularly the speed, the level, the complexity, and the multiple players involved with the data that's going to be generated with automated vehicles. So, thank you very much for hearing me talk. I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions? Yeah, hello.
Yes, early on I got the impression from what you're saying that navigation is a bigger challenge for automatic vehicle than what you call obstacle avoidance, like pedestrians.
Yeah.
Is that for that?
Yeah, look, there's a continuity. So obstacle avoidance at low speed is easy. You stop. The obstacle avoidance at freeway speed is non-existent. You hit something almost. Yeah, or if you go around it. It's that middle. It's that standard urban driving that's really hard, because the obstacle avoidance would also involve questions of journey planning. So, do I go around here? Do I stop here? Do I do that? It's higher level, more complex levels of decision making, and that's where the real challenge is. And so if they can get rid of some of the macro decision making about journey, 5G it, have some of that decision being made back in the mothership in the corporation, and therefore the robot itself is just making short-term obstacle avoidance decisions.
When to change lanes.
Yeah, you can have more confidence that it's going to do that safely and well if it's in a really mapped or 5G compliant environment. It's more. This is why the Tesla's having, where we're not getting those self-driving level 5 cars quite yet. That's a much harder thing for an entirely self-enclosed robot like the Tesla is to make that decision. Yeah, hello.
Has any consideration been given to the possibilities that a hostile nation might interfere with the dissemination of data so that potentially a whole nation could come to a standstill?
Yep.
So, has that been looked at?
It is absolutely at the forefront of all this. And so the questions of the data security of these systems is a really big concern. And the problem here is they argue that the more these machines can be connected, the better they will be at doing their job as driving themselves. However, the more they're connected, the more vulnerable they will be to external hacking. And so there's a real balance at stake with all this. Yeah, the ability of a rogue nation or a terrorist group to hack into these systems and cause utter chaos is obvious. And the tension is between, communication is what's needed for these things to work, but communication is the point of vulnerability for these systems themselves. And do we have a solution to that? Absolutely not. And it's an arms race. Every time we develop what we think is unbreakable encryption, someone comes along and breaks it. And ultimately, there has to be a value decision made that these things are safe enough, as we do all the time. This vehicle is safe enough. Will it be safe? Can you guarantee it'll be 100% safe all the time? No, we can't. But it meets the criteria. These are the standards. It meets those standards. That's, at this stage, what we think is good enough. And that's going to be the role of the national regulator to make those sort of calls. Yeah?
I assume it's been implied through today's forum that all this automation is associated with an electric vehicle. Does the same automation, in all your examples, were they all electric vehicles?
No, not at all.
Not at all.
So that true line truck, that's just a diesel prime mover. Right. A standard, a very nice, brand new diesel prime mover. So automation doesn't at all need to be connected to the motivation source.
So in something like that example, what does that actually cost to the trucking company to automate that type of vehicle, generally, in a cost?
Well, look, these people will happily give you a quote. you know, we're talking pretty high level, top shelf material to build these things. You know, the full suite of sensors, the really complicated stuff. Though we're talking on the stuff I've seen, it's sort of double the price to get. And then these ones are only running on a very dedicated route, so a high bandwidth route where.
I'm assuming in those situations, is it the company itself that's accepting that liability of?
Yeah. So for these guys, they're not on selling those vehicles. These are their vehicles for their company, and they're selling what they claim is a better delivery service for other companies within this route, because their vehicles operate non-stop, they're safer, they get environmental credits because they argue their vehicles are constantly on the road, they're not slowing down, they're not doing stuff like this, so they've somehow got some benefits from the California legislature to make these things more attractive for other people to hire them. But yeah, that is a delivery company package, that vehicle and the service they provide. Yeah. There are people developing, all the main, Volvo, for example, is developing, level 3, 4 and 5 autonomous rigs to sell to people. Yeah.
I read somewhere that one development for highway driving was to have trains of vehicles, where you have one human driver at the front and other vehicles just tag along behind, and they don't have a driver. Is there anything happening with that?
Yeah, that was some of the early thinking. Some of the early thinking was to build sort of drone. You have the master vehicle and then the drones clicking behind. That hasn't sort of taken off, mainly because the private, the people that are driving this technology in the private vehicle market want to sell you a really expensive car that can go anywhere. Yeah, they want the standard model car just with automation on top of it. And therefore they don't want to connect. Their argument is that people just want to buy a car and use it. They don't want to intergage with anyone else. And so that idea sort of fell away. It also fell away with the engineer's dream that these things will eventually be cheap enough and effective enough to be arguably better than a human driver in all circumstances. And so we don't. Why go to the halfway house of having a sort of a.
Maybe for heavy vehicles, so you can imagine a train or trucks going
Yep.
across the road. That might be feasible.
Yeah, we actually ran that in Brisbane here, along the we closed the highway at the port, and we ran. So that's called connected intelligent transport systems. So it was all the rage about 10 years ago, and we did run a truck with drone trucks behind it on a closed highway in the middle of the night to test that style equipment. So yeah, being developed, tended to die away. The vision is very much the standalone robot can do it all. But the ecological advantage remains with automated vehicles. So the vision is that the automated vehicles' response time's better. They'll talk to each other so that they can platoon like that, and of course that will significantly reduce drag, and therefore make these things more efficient. They also argue that you'll then be able, most of the highway, even at peak hour, is gap. So the vision is, the argument was that if you automated our vehicle fleet in Queensland, you would essentially double the size of something like the M1, because it could take double the capacity with automation. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Tranter. You've certainly, by judging by the number of questions, you've certainly got us stimulated to unpack this issue. So on behalf of Renew, I would like to present you with this certificate of appreciation, and it entitles you to a subscription of either of the sister magazines in the company.
Thank you very much.
Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Our next speaker for the meeting, which will begin in about barely 5 minutes,